Hi, and welcome to Knife Chats. Today we're going to be talking about traditional pattern knives, the Camp Scout pattern. So a few years ago, I made a video on the traditional pattern Scout knife, also known as a camp knife or utility knife. This is what they look like. In that video, I made a glaring mistake, so I have since taken it down. I'm going to edit out the mistake, but I think I do need to explain what went wrong with it. Originally, I had said that this knife was based on this knife, the Swiss Army soldier's knife. I'd also said that this knife had been designed by Carl Elsner of Victorinox fame. Both of those comments were wrong. Also, this knife has been altered. This should be a nice long spear blade. But you do see that this has all the blades of a typical camp knife or scout knife. And the reason for that is when the Swiss government sent out a contract for a new knife for their new rifle, one of the things they wanted was a screwdriver here that would be suitable for taking apart their rifle. And the contracts originally went out to companies in Germany because Switzerland did not have a knife industry capable of fulfilling the contract. And the original 1890 knives were actually made in Germany, and it wasn't until 1891 that Carl Elsner started producing the Swiss soldier's knife in Switzerland. And then later a few other people started making them also in Switzerland. In any case, the knife here is just a camp knife, and the pattern pre-existed 1890. In fact, they probably went back as far as 1869, according to Boker. Boker claims to have been making camp knives that early, and those camp knives had everything you see here. Now, if you notice, let me close the main blade. I don't want to cut my finger off. One of the things you do notice here is it's just a screwdriver, and that's mainly because the crown cork or bottle cap that we know today did not exist before 1892. That's when they first were introduced, and the cap lifters started appearing first on can openers and then later in the screwdriver portion of knives or on camp knives sometime in the 1890s, early 1900s. So that's why the Swiss soldier's knife does not have a cap lifter, even though this one is from 1942. You got to remember, a soldier did not really need a cap lifter, so that's why they did not bother to add it into there. And they were just using a pre-existing design that was around. Now, to look a little closer at this, I'm going to hold this out so I can hold them each. If you notice, the Swiss Army soldier's knife is basically built on the frame of a bearhead jack. The knife above there is an electrician's knife, or the TL-29 used by the U.S. Army. So the frame used for the Swiss soldier's knife was a bearhead jack. These frames used by the Boy Scouts, this is also a knife from 1942, not from 1910, but very similar to what you would have seen in a Boy Scout knife in 1910 or 1911. These were built on the cigar frame, which was very popular in old stock knives or stockmans, and we see here a stockman in the cigar frame with the punch. We can see how close the two knives kind of look. So that's really a big difference between the two. One is built on a bearhead jack frame. The other is built on a cigar frame, but both of them were types of camp knives, and the camp knife frame or the camp knife pattern in general probably started around the 1870s, not with the introduction of the Swiss Army soldier's knife. With that said, let's move on to the rest of the video.
Hello and welcome to Cutlery Cavern. The knife I'm going to be looking at today is the Scout knife. This is a continuation of my series on traditional pattern folders and how to recognize them. This is probably one of the most recognized knives in the world. It is not the most collected these days, but at one time it probably was. It appeals to both people who collect Boy Scout memorabilia as well as people who collect knives or multi-tools. This particular knife was not at all popular until the Boy Scouts of America adopted it as their #1 knife back in 1910. Before then, it pretty much laid around in obscurity. And it had not really been around that long either, when you get right down to it, because there was no need for can openers or cap lifters on knives back before, say, 1860 for the can opener, and around 1892 or so for a cap lifter, because there were no cans to open and there were no bottles to open with a cap lifter. Now, the shape of this handle actually came from the very popular Stockman knives of the day, which looked like thus. And it's a cigar-shaped handle, which was adopted and then had these blades added to it. And so you have the can opener, in this case one that was developed after 1946 and became universally used on most camp knives after 1956. Before then, Imperial held a patent on it, and only Imperial knives had it between 46 and 56. And then you have the screwdriver blade with the cap lifter. The cap lifter was added sometime between 1890 and 1910 because it became a very prominent feature by 1910 on all sorts of camping knives. The leather punch still remained very popular because it was used for everything from leather to wood for reaming holes and such. And the Spearmaster blade remained very much the common blade. So that's what the Scout knife looks like. The reason it's typically called a Scout knife is because it was adopted by the Boy Scouts. However, it is often also referred to as a camp knife or a utility knife. Now, the difference between those is also something that you can blame on the Boy Scouts. If the knife has bolsters and then a handle in between the two bolsters, the Boy Scouts referred to it as a camp knife. If the knife was a bolsterless pattern and had either a metal frame or a plastic covering or anything that went from end to end, it was referred to as a utility knife. So if it's got plastic or metal handles that go from end to end, it's referred to as a utility knife. But if it has bolsters and something that looks like stag or bone, regardless of if it's plastic or Delrin or whatever, it's usually referred to as a camp knife. You will also sometimes see bolsterless patterns that have stag from end to end, and those will usually also be referred to as a camp knife. But if it's 4 blades, and these are the blades, then it's usually referred to as a Scout knife or a camp knife. Now, a variation of that is this knife, which is a type of utility knife. It's the one that was developed by the U.S. military back in 1944, and the military referred to it as a utility knife at the time, and that's probably why the Boy Scouts continued to call knives that were bolsterless a utility knife. If you notice, the blade choice is the same as you find on your Scout knife. So let me get them all open. So blade choices remain the same, but it's referred to as a utility knife, and actually if it's made for the military, it's often referred to as a demo knife because it was used by people who were using demolitions. And it's also often called a milk knife, M-I-L-K. The reason they call it that is because the M-I-L stood for military and the K stands for knife. Originally it was an M-I-L-J because the J stood for jackknife, but later they changed it to just knife, and it made a much better acronym than MILJ. So it became a milk knife. So you can call this a utility knife, a military knife, a milk knife, or a demo knife. This is often called just a scout knife or a camp knife. If it has more than just the 4 blades, it's usually referred to by the number of blades that it has, like a 5-blade or a 6 implement or something like that, scout knife. One particular type of scout knife that became very popular once Phillips head screwdrivers came out, or the cross screws came out, was one that had a Phillips screwdriver attached to it. These came out after the 1930s, and it has a Phillips screwdriver along with all the other blades, and it's usually referred to as the deluxe scout knife, or a 5-blade scout knife. It usually does not have a bail, which most other camp knives or scout knives do. That pretty much covers most of it. If you notice in earlier scout knives, the types of can openers will vary. So this is like the Half Moon can opener. This is your typical claw type can opener. There's a variety of these, and you'll usually see these on camp knives or scout knives that were made before World War II, or during World War II. So anytime before like 1945 or so, they have different types of can openers on there. After the 1950s or so, you start seeing the modern can opener, which is known as the safety can opener, show up. However, you can know that these knives are made after World War II, but just because a knife has a different style of can opener does not necessarily mean it's an older knife, because, for instance, Rough Rider uses one of the most earliest of can openers, the triangular or punch type can opener on their knife, and this is a modern version of a scout knife. So older style can openers can show up on new camp knives, but the safety can opener will not show up on an old camp knife. So this definitely means that it's from the modern era or post-World War II. That'll help you a little bit when you're looking for scout knives. And the thing to also remember is everyone makes some kind of scout or camp knife, but unless it has the fleur-de-lis on it, it's not a true official Boy Scout knife. And most of the official Boy Scout knives will have a blade etch. If the blade etch is intact and showing up good, then the value of that Boy Scout knife will be higher. Good Boy Scout knives in excellent condition, the ones that are in tip-top shape, that are made in the United States, will be worth quite a bit more than a knife such as this, which was just a scout knife made by a random company that was also made in the United States. You can still get these older camp knives for anywhere from like $5 to $10, sometimes maybe $15. But if this was an official Boy Scout knife that was made back in the 1920s or so, and if it was in excellent shape, it would be valued into the hundreds of dollars as opposed to the tens of dollars. So that's something to also keep in mind when you're looking at collecting camp knives. Quality matters, and if it was an official Boy Scout knife versus just a scout knife made by any company. So keep those things in mind when you're collecting, and have fun doing it. As you can probably tell, the camp knife or the scout knife is one of my favorite patterns to collect. I have probably, I would say 25% of my collection involves scout knives of all types. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.
As always, thanks for dropping by, and remember, you're only as sharp as your knife.